author of all good things, we humbly beseech thee for the Parliament of Barbados, especially the Senate at this time assembled, that thou wouldst be pleased to direct and prosper all their counsels, to the advancement of thy glory, the good of thy church, and the safety, honor, and welfare of all people. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ, our most blessed Lord and Savior. Amen.
Amen.
Together the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread,
And forgive us
our trespasses, as we forgive those that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the President. Announcements by His Honor the Speaker.
First of all, let me take this opportunity to welcome everyone back. I wish you a very happy, healthy, and prosperous new year. This is an exciting year for us, much on the agenda. We look forward to as good or even better year in 2025 that we had together in 2024. So I wish you and all of your families all of the very best, and thank you for your continued service to our country. We have before us minutes of our meeting held on 29th November 2024 for confirmation. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I'd like to move the confirmation of the minutes of our meeting held on Friday, the 29th of November, 2024.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting held on November 29th, 2024 be confirmed. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Those minutes stand confirmed. We have minutes of our meeting on Wednesday, 18th of December, 2024 to be deferred. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I'd like to move the deferral of the minutes of Wednesday, the 18th of December, 2024.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, 18th December 2024 be deferred. Those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Those minutes are deferred. In terms of our attendance today, we have apologies for absence from Senator Ryan Walters and an indication of lateness from Senator, the Most Honorable Jerome Walcott, and Senator Gregory Nichols.
Presentation of petition, presentation of papers, reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate and moved by minister.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to introduce the resolution for the Barbados Fiscal Framework 2024-2025. Mr. President, I beg to give notice and to move the first readings of the following bills. The
first reading of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Bill 2025, and then the first reading of the Road Traffic Amendment Bill 2025.
Motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate are moved by Minister.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The things the ayes have it. Standing Order 45-2 is therefore suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Introduction of bills. First reading.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the following bills: the Right of Persons with Disabilities Bill 2025 and the first reading of the Road Traffic Amendment Bill 2025.
The question is that the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Bill 2025 and the Road Traffic Amendment Bill 2025 be read a first time. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. The things the ayes have it, those bills are accordingly read the first time.
Public business.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 6, in the name of Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution that the Parliament of Barbados approve the national policy for improving the lives of persons with disabilities and the 2023 National Report of the National Advisory Committee to guide the establishment of a commission for improving the lives of persons with disabilities.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I rise to beg your permission to treat as a cognate debate items number 6, number 8, and number 9, which are all related to the same subject matter, persons with disabilities.
The question is that items number 6, which is the resolution on the policy of improving the lives of persons with disabilities, and the report of the National Advisory Committee to guide the establishment of a commission for improving the lives of persons with disabilities. And order number 8, the first reading of the bill arising from that report, the bill being the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Bill 2025, and the amendment to the Road Traffic Act. So the Road Traffic Amendment Bill 2025 be treated as a cognate debate. And just for the reminder that this means that the matters in the second reading relating to those 3 items, all the policy matters will be discussed in one debate, but then the votes will be taken, or the matters will be voted on individually as 3 separate items according to our standing orders and procedure. Will those honorable senators in favor of having the cognate debate on items 6, 8, and 9, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. We therefore have a cognate debate on the second reading related to these 3 items. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I too would wish to join you in welcoming the honorable members of the Senate back into the chamber. This is our first meeting for 2025, and when last we met, I believe that you were all being offered congratulations on a successful year, and you were being wished Merry Christmas at the time. Now we are looking ahead to a new year, 2025, and I am confident that the same enthusiasm and commitment that we brought into 2024, we are now at a heightened level in 2025, and I want to also take the opportunity to wish you a happy 2025, filled with purpose and delivery of results on behalf of the people of Barbados as they expect of this chamber. We start the year, Mr. President, with a resolution on a debate with a debate before us that is on persons with disabilities. There are 3 items that we will be discussing today. We are joined today also, I want to acknowledge the presence of the simultaneous interpreters who will be interpreting for those who are watching the debate and rightfully have an interest in what is being discussed here by all of the members of the Honorable Senate, and I want to recognize their participation in our debate today. They are a welcome addition, and perhaps it will be more welcome, even more so, if they are with us permanently in both chambers to ensure that the business of the country is at all times being interpreted for those who are hearing impaired. Now, Mr. President, the 3 items that we are discussing today as a cognate debate relate first to the national policy on persons with disabilities. It is an outcome of the commission that was chaired by a member from the other place, the Honorable Edmund Hinkson, who has long been recognized as an advocate on behalf of persons with disabilities. That commission was constituted in 2023. It conducted extensive consultations with members of the public, and it was led by persons who represent a cross-section of persons from in our community, but in particular with an interest in ensuring the inclusion of persons with disabilities. It also, Mr. President, had the representation of a member of our own chamber, who you will hear from during the course of today's debate, Senator Andwele Boyce, himself an advocate on behalf of persons living with disabilities and a member of this chamber, I believe the second member to serve at this level as a person with disability, third person to serve at this level as a person living with a disability, and he has been a well-presented, welcomed member of this honorable chamber. Last year, I believe we joined him to hear his own story one evening after we had a sitting of this chamber in the Grand Salle, and his presentation of his story and his journey as a person living with a disability was as inspiring then as I am sure it has been whenever he has spoken on this subject matter from this honorable chamber, and I am certain that when he speaks later on today, that it will also inspire persons to see his journey and his evolution as a person to now have contributed in no small way to the work of the commission led by Member of Parliament, Mr. Edmund Hinkson. So, Mr. President, we started out with a policy. The second item that we will be debating as part of this cognate discussion, Mr. President, is the policy then being codified by way of legislation. Policy is great, and I think that certainly we have seen in Barbados and across the region so many instances where reports are done, commissions are held, work has an output, and the reports sit on a shelf, and we talk about implementation deficits. They're not implemented, but not so, Mr. President, with this important issue. We are simultaneously now, today, having a discussion on the findings of the committee, of the commission, going through the report and its recommendations, and there are 13 thematic policy areas that you will see in the report, and then also acknowledging that that report has been codified into law by way of the Disabilities Bill. It speaks to a number of areas that I will go through in a few moments, but then there's a third piece of legislation, the third item that we are debating today, a second piece of legislation, and it is an amendment to the Road Traffic Act. Mr. President, I must tell you that this particular piece of legislation as an amendment treating to persons with disabilities and parking is particularly a bugbearer for me. And I think on more than one occasion in this chamber, I have spoken about the number of times I have gone into supermarket car parks, public places in car parks, and seen able-bodied persons parking indiscriminately, taxi drivers parking indiscriminately in spaces that are reserved for persons with disabilities. And it is a point of pleasure for me today to see legislation coming today that increases the fines for persons who do that. I believe, Mr. President, on one occasion, I spoke about being in Carlton Car Park. It was Carlton Supermarket Car Park on one morning, and I parked. And the car park was not full on that occasion, Mr. President. There was absolutely no reason for it. There were more than enough open spaces where people had an option to park, but this one individual opted, because it was more convenient for him, to park in the area. And I remember as I got out of my car and I was walking into the supermarket, as Bajan men sometimes are wont to do, I passed him and he tried to chat me up. And he probably thought that I was one of those unmannerly women because I kept my head straight. And he said to me, "You don't talk to people now?" And I said, "I don't talk to able-bodied people who park in disabled parking spaces." And I kept walking because I was offended by him. I was offended by what he had done. And so, Mr. President, I thought to myself, well, if some person comes and they have a disability of some kind, if they have to get out of a vehicle with a wheelchair, if they have to be assisted, the parking spaces and the parking bays are bigger for persons with disabilities for a reason, and they are closer for a reason. And it takes nothing off of Barbadians to park in areas where you can make your way to your storefront with no difficulty, instead of having to park in a space that is specifically reserved for a person who needs the access. And so the third item on the debate today is an amendment to the Road Traffic Act, which is a very short amendment, and so I'm going to dispense with that first. It reads very simply: a person who contravenes the legislation is guilty of an offense and is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $5,000. Take the extra 2, 3, 5, 10 steps and park in areas that are available and stop parking in spaces that are reserved for persons with disabilities. This is now about enforcing the legislation. And in fact, I would like to see us go even further. I would like to see us introducing measures that clamp people's vehicles. So, okay, so you thought it was easier for you to park in a space for a disabled person, and you thought that you would get away with it, and if the police don't find you, or the security guard doesn't report to the police, and they don't get there in time, you walk away without consequences. I would welcome the occasion where people would come back out of a supermarket or out of a bank and not be able to move their vehicles at all, because they have either been clamped or they have been towed away because you are indiscriminately parking in a space that is reserved for persons with disabilities. But this is a start. This is a start, and it is a disincentive. Stop parking in disabled parking spaces. And so this is order number 9 on the order paper, a short amendment, but I'm hopeful a powerful amendment that sends a message to the public of Barbados. Now, Mr. President, if I were to go back then to the policy overall and to share a little bit about what is captured in the policy, I want, though, to start with a bit of a personal story. Because, you know, there's a saying that says, and I saw it recently somewhere, I don't even remember where it was, but it said, there are different points of view, but there are different viewpoints from which you can see the same scenario. And Mr. President, I have grown up without a physical or any other kind of disability that would prevent me from interacting with the world on a day-to-day basis or require me to have a special consideration given. But when I was 18. I was 18 years old, and I was a first-year student at Mona campus in Jamaica. Active, busy, always in everything. And then I was coming home for Christmas on holiday one year, and I sustained an injury. And I couldn't be active and busy anymore. And as I came home for Christmas, for the first time in my life, I could not board the aircraft, and they had to make an arrangement for me to be facilitated with a wheelchair because my right knee was swollen. It was as big as a breadfruit, Mr. President, and so I could not walk on it. So in order for me to get home and to find my way through Norman Manley International Airport and then come into Barbados, I had to be facilitated with a wheelchair. Mr. President, that point of view, that viewpoint was an experience for me because I would not have seen it before. The experience, Mr. President, of having to depend on someone to assist you to have mobility was new. The ability, Mr. President, to reach up and to take something from a shelf that was just out of your reach was new. The ability not to be able to drive yourself from point A to point B was new. The ability, Mr. President, or rather I should say the inability, to be able to do the things that you would ordinarily do without facilitation, like simply going up steps to enter a building, was impossible for me. That lasted, Mr. President, for as long as it took. My grandmother showed up at my house with some soursop leaves, I think it was. In addition to what the doctor prescribed, my grandmother showed up at my house with some soursop leaves, banded up my knee, put some bad smelling stuff on it. I don't know what it was. Maybe veggies, I don't even know what it was. Then they took me to some doctor that I had never seen before, and first thing he did was to give me a dose of shark oil. And then they put this ultraviolet light on my knee, and my knee, over time, it went down, and life returned to normal for me. But Mr. President, that one experience gave me a different viewpoint from which to view persons who navigate life every single day, attempting to do the things that many of us take for granted. So, Mr. President, when an entire commission is constituted in 2023, and when governments, certainly over the last several years, go through the process of looking at how we as a country, we as a society, treat to persons with disabilities of all kinds, permanent, and yes, a new inclusion has been the mention of persons with a temporary disability. This is because, Mr. President, it has to be a part of how we as a society see ourselves. And so in the report, Mr. President, it speaks about inclusion of persons with disabilities. It talks about the treatment of persons with disabilities, promoting and advancing and protection their full human rights and fundamental freedoms of all persons, strengthening and enhancing national awareness, our commitment and our energy towards supporting and protecting and advocating, much like Senator Andrea Boyce has been doing, for their rights, their needs, and their concerns, making sure that people feel seen and heard with disabilities in all spaces of Barbadian society, not just some spaces, but all spaces. Foster and maintain a national environment in which all forms of marginalization, discrimination, and non-inclusion, and all other barriers and constraints affecting persons with disabilities are eliminated. It talks about, in the policy, Mr. President, creating the enabling environment for persons with disabilities to have full access to all essential opportunities, the resources, the services, and benefits that will serve and lead to enhancing their independent functioning, meaningful participation and engagement, and the overall personal and professional growth and development in Barbados. It allows for the creation, Mr. President, of an overarching strategic orientation and framework in which the development of the policy strategies and companion activities can be operationalized, executed for all persons with disabilities and their related beneficiaries in the country. Overall, Mr. President, we're talking about a fully inclusive society. We're talking about a Barbados for all. We're talking about a Barbados that does not exclude any of its citizens, and it allows, Mr. President, for everyone to feel as though they have a stake in our society. Now, Mr. President, when we go through the policy, if I were to go through the legislation, the two match. So the policy speaks about education, access to education. And when we talk about access to education, we're including things, Mr. President, such as in Part 5 of the legislation in sections 27 through 34, the right to education. Free primary, secondary, and trained teachers. We're not just talking, Mr. President, about what we know as the right to education, where we all walk into a classroom, we walk into a school, and we know that we are guaranteed access to education. The former president of the Senate, who also would have participated extensively in this process, Carrie-Ann Eiffel, who has been a champion for persons with disabilities for a long time, spoke about, and I'm sure that many of us in the society would have seen her talking about her journey through the University of the West Indies as a student. What it took for the University of the West Indies to engage with her and to make sure that she was able to graduate with her degree using Braille to be able to read her textbooks and to be able to undertake her access to her examinations. This has been a change. We've heard that from other persons as well in the disabled community. And so equally, when we talk about access to education, we're not just talking about access to education in the same way that you or I may engage with the education system, but access to education for persons with different types of disabilities without prohibition, without exclusion, and to ensure that they are able to have a full education experience without having to deal with the difficulties that we have heard of in the past. In employment, Mr. President, we're talking about equal access to employment. In the other place, when this debate came up, there was an extensive debate about the challenges persons are facing with disabilities and persons being employed. Now, I am a Rotarian. I find myself saying that in every debate, but it's true. I'm a Rotarian, and I remember in previous years, there are two projects that we have anchored as the Rotary Club of Barbados. One, Mr. President, was the facilitation of the provision of wheelchairs for persons to be able to go into the sea. Again, something we take for granted, Mr. President. We get to the beach, we pull up, park the car, get off the bus, walk to the beach, and we go down the sand and we get into the water, taken for granted. But what of a person with a disability, a physical disability in particular, who is unable to navigate that in the same way? The Rotary Club of Barbados, in one of our earlier projects, would have provided wheelchairs to the National Disabilities Unit to ensure that persons, including locals and visitors to our country, because we must never assume that all visitors that come to Barbados for sun, sea, and sand are also able to access sun, sea, and sand without a disability. And so the Rotary Club would have provided those resources years ago, and it is a project that I believe has continued, and there has also always been a demand for that to be expanded. Equally so, the Rotary Club of Barbados is the facilitator of a project called the Schoolhouse for Children with Special Needs. I remain a trustee on that project, one of the 4 trustees for that project when it was first established. We own the building, we provide that safe space for kids, and so the opportunity is there. Thirdly, the Rotary Club of Barbados South, and we in this place would have approved the vesting of land in the Rotary Club of Barbados South projects for the provision of land at the gymnasium for them to launch a project which has long been on the agenda, inclusive play. And the purpose of that was to allow for children now with disabilities to play alongside children without disabilities and to ensure that inclusion was made practical for young people. And so, Mr. President, this is an all-of-society initiative. And the reason I bring up the Rotary Club is not just because I'm a Rotarian, even though I have said so, but because so many other social service clubs, so many other social groups, charity groups, we also were here, Mr. President, and we vested the building and the land in the Barbados Autism Association for them to be able, as a community group, to be able to support persons with disabilities. And so I say in this debate today that while the government has anchored the policy, while the government is anchoring the legislation, and while the government is making the amendment in terms of enforcing road traffic, that there is a all of society, all of community, all of Barbados approach that is required to ensure that persons with disabilities can live full and inclusive lives in this Barbados, which also belongs to them. But it is also a national brand. It also has to be about a national brand. So Barbados Our Prime Minister is a global climate champion, and she has been seen all over the world. Funny enough, I was in a meeting, I was overseas at a meeting until yesterday evening, and in that meeting, every person, every other person, and everybody in between talked about Prime Minister Mottley and her advocacy on climate. Does Barbados also have an ambition to be that nation in the world that everyone talks about in terms of inclusion and how we represent all people in our society and caring for every member of our society? I can see a Barbados coming out of this policy, coming out of this legislation, coming out of work in the communities by social service groups, and coming out of this national conversation that we're now having with the nation, emerging with the champions that we are seeing already in the persons who sit on this commission, in the persons who sat in the other place when this debate in the gallery, in the visitors gallery, when this matter was being debated, in the persons we saw featured in the newspaper, calling for a continuation of this discussion and this kind of work. I can see Barbados continuing to raise its profile and being that nation that the rest of the world recognizes as a leader on inclusion and inclusivity for persons with disabilities. And I am confident that the persons who have been anchoring this so far are within reach of accomplishing that goal. Mr. President, as a minister with responsibility for business, I also want to say that under the Fund Access and under trust loans, we are also committed to ensuring not just the provision of financial capability and financial resources to persons who wish to start businesses in whatever the sector is, but persons coming from the disabled community, to make sure that we provide them not just with the financial resources, but the technical assistance as part of their own enfranchisement, not just for the purpose of creating employment opportunities for them, but for them in turn, providing employment opportunities for others. It goes on, Mr. President, to mirror the policy with the legislation in Part 8, under healthcare. Sections 47 through 52 speak about the right of persons with a disability to have access to equal health care. And just like we did with education, healthcare facilities also have to be accessible. Are we building buildings that persons can access? Are there ramps? Are there elevators? In this building, Mr. President, this old building, we went for a long time without having a functioning elevator. It meant that Senator Boyce, who claims the stairs, and the stairs are not inconsequential, those stairs are significant. And we have seen Senator Andrea Boyce at every sitting of this honorable chamber having climbed those stairs. There are other members who, when they have a temporary disability, have found it difficult to climb those stairs, and the absence of a working elevator in this building has been a challenge. I am happy that we now have an elevator functioning, but it is important that in all government buildings, in all public spaces, that access for persons with disabilities is a priority. The legislation calls for it to be so. Social protection is a significant section of this legislation under Part 8, sections 53 through 55. And this is important, Mr. President, and in the broader agenda, the broader social policy agenda, under the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs, this is a significant conversation that has been taking place, certainly with all of the social agencies and also with the nation. And you've heard the Minister with responsibility for People Empowerment and Elder Affairs speaking about the creation of the amalgamated entities into a single social service entity. That, Mr. President, is there for persons with disabilities, yes, but it is also for persons coming from the wider cross-section of our community. Now, sports, culture, and recreation, I know that Senator John King is going to be quite excited about the provision there for access and participation in sport, culture, and recreational activities, as will be Senator Dr. Chantal Monroe-Knight as the Minister of State in the Ministry with responsibility for culture. And then, Mr. President, there is a special provision here in Part 9 around accommodation and premises, which allows for non-discrimination in relation to the disposal of premises, access to housing, and reasonable accommodation in respect of existing premises. So, Mr. President, the legislation is a mirror of the policy. It is a mirror of the report of the commission. The process for the commission, Mr. President, was also extensive. There was a special committee, one of the standing committees of Parliament, and so the report of the commission went before the standing committee of the two houses of Parliament. In that committee, Mr. President, there was even further discussion. It was chaired by the Honourable Edmund Hinkson. In his report, you will see what is there, and we will hear a little bit more over the course of today's presentation from the other member of that commission who sits in this chamber on the substantive discussions that took place there. But, Mr. President, the combination of the amendment to the Road Traffic Act, which is a penalty amendment, the policy, which is before us, and the legislation on the bill, which is also before us, Mr. President, is a reflection of a government that is committed to supporting people. People at all levels. We've come to this honorable chamber, Mr. President, to serve. All of us in this room, regardless of the side of the table we sit on, have come here for the purpose of serving the Barbadian people. We may see it from different points of view. Our viewpoint may be different. We may not always agree, but one thing unites us, Mr. President, and it is that commitment to serving people. We could be anywhere else, Mr. President. Any of us could have said no. But we're all here, Mr. President, because fundamentally, all of us have a commitment to service, serving people. And this government is committed to facilitating that inclusion, to having all voices. Now, you know, Mr. President, one of the things that I want to say in this debate in particular, there's a cynicism in the country at many times, and sometimes it's warranted, sometimes it is not. On matters relating to persons with disabilities, as I have started, this is a commission that was established in 2023. The government did not have to do it. The government committed to doing it in its manifestos, and it followed through on the commitment. Promise made, promise kept. It established the committee. It did not just establish the committee, Mr. President, and just leave it. It did not just establish the commission and do nothing with it. The commission consulted nationally. It had town halls. It engaged with people. And then, after the commission completed its work, we still brought the report resulting from that extensive process underway in the commission to a select committee of Parliament, allowing people from all walks of life to come and to make presentations. Then the policy was codified into law, as I have said, and now we have seen the debates in the other place and the debates here today. I want to commend the members of the persons with the community of persons with disabilities. They came out in their numbers when it was being debated in the other place. They attended the town halls extensively. They wrote, they spoke to members of the commission. Even I, as an individual member of this chamber, had persons who approached me and asked specific questions who I then was able to refer to the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs. When I say, Mr. President, that there are different points of view and different views from which you can see the same thing, sometimes, Mr. President, because we personally may not have been present, or we personally may not have been privy to all of the details, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It doesn't mean it's not there. And what we have seen in both the report and what we have seen in the other place in the discussion is a clear representation that inclusion is not just a philosophy, but it is a way of being for this government. And I want to commend the honorable members of the community from persons with disabilities. I want to commend the chair of the commission, the Honorable Edmund Hinkson. I want to commend our own in this chamber, Senator Andrelia Boyce, for their leadership, their advocacy, and their commitment. And Mr. President, it has been my role as leader of government business to introduce these matters. I have done so, but I have done so in a deliberate way to be framing the conversation only, simply because today we will deviate very slightly from our standard way of being, and we will hear in great detail from the honorable member of this chamber who sat on the commission and on the committee who will go into the details of the specifics of the policy, where they originated, why the policy is crafted in the way that it is, because unlike me, unlike many of us, we don't sit inside the community of persons with disabilities, even those of us who have had temporary moments with disabilities. The persons who live with disabilities are represented by Senator Andrelia Boyce among us today. And today, we will both see and hear from him as he shares on behalf of those persons in his community who we are gathered here today to ensure that we are codifying in legislation our commitment for their inclusion in a just society, a just Barbados that includes all of them having equal access to all of the things that we take for granted. And so my 18-year-old self, temporarily disabled and unable to travel except in a wheelchair, is able to stand here today with great pride and beg to move that this bill be read a second time and to allow for the remainder of the debate to evolve. And I beg to move that this resolution do now pass.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I rise to beg the suspension of
Clerk, if Senator Cummings wants to move a motion, so you need to go back to that point in the agenda.
Yes, please. Motions relating to the business or feelings of the Senate are moved by a minister, recommitted.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I rise to beg to move that the committal of Article Clause 32A2 of the standing orders, which will allow for Senator Andrelia Boyce to speak and to be afforded a longer time than is ordinarily given to members of the Senate. And I beg to move at this time that Senator Andrelia Boyce, who will now rise to speak, that Article 32, Clause 32A2 be applied.
And just for clarity, honourable members, Senator Cummings is proposing that that clause limits the time of speaking to no more than 30 minutes for members, to obviously 32A2 of our standard orders be suspended in favor of Senator Boyce only as member of the commission to have a little more latitude which will be circumscribed by me. It will not be it's not an open-ended amendment, just a slight act of generosity, if members are so minded, to allow Senator Boyce to give a perspective of the commission and to add to the debate in that matter. So it's a procedural motion subject only to the approval of members of the Honourable Senate. So the question is that Standing Order 32A2 related to time of contribution be suspended for the limitation of the contribution of Senator Andrelia Boyce as a member of the National Commission of Persons with Disability in this matter. The Honourable Senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. I want to thank Senator Worrell for his cooperation in this matter as well. Thank you very much, Senator Worrell. Senator Andrelia Boyce.
Thank you for recognizing me, Mr. President. Thank you to my colleague senators for their support in the extension of the time, and I do note to your caution, sir, that I will be constrained if need be. Mr. President, today is a good day. If I'm perfectly honest with you, it is a day that I didn't always think would come. Because while I have long believed in the capacity of this country to do that which it has not done before, and to make good and to make better on the promises to the people of Barbados, there are moments as a person with a disability where the issues that confronted me, and I do not stand alone in this, the issues that confronted the community seemed just too large and slightly outside the capacity of this country. However, sir, the work that the government of Barbados has done on this issue since 2022 has reminded me, if I needed reminding, that nothing is beyond the capacity of a country that wishes to do better. And it is in that vein, sir, that we set about to do the work of the National Advisory Commission. On the day many of us on this side were sworn in, the Honorable Prime Minister exhorted us that this was going to be the administration that made a difference in the lives of people with disabilities. And so I am extremely pleased today to stand and be able to contribute to this debate. On the previous occasions that I've stood in here to address you on related matters, I have said, and in some ways update you on the progress of our work as a committee, I have said that the work that the government is doing, the proposals contained in the policy and in the law, Mr. President, are exactly what I would have needed as a person with a disability 20 and 30 years ago. And again, I do not stand alone in that. There's a community that needed that which we consider here today. And so there must be an admission that the time has come and perhaps the time has passed for this work. But, Mr. President, we are grateful nonetheless. And I'm proud as a Barbadian to stand here and participate in what is the expansion of our democracy. Because I think it is very easy to think about this in the context of protecting persons with disabilities alone. The cumulative effect of this work is really to expand our democracy. It is not lost on me, sir, that I stand in a parliament, that we all stand in a parliament that considered a slave code. And now, today, we stand in a parliament that considers the rights of persons with disabilities. Our country is never perfect, but it is our work to make it just and even more just still. I turn now to the specific work of the committee. Sir, the committee was established because there was a recognition on the part of the government that yes, it was necessary, but also that the work of improving, transforming, I would say, the lives of persons with disabilities could not be confined to a set of civil servants somewhere, Mr. President, detached from the lived experience of persons with disabilities. We had to engage with this community and to engage with the community forthrightly and to hear and have proximity to their pain, to their plight, and to their demands for this country. And that is why the committee was established. The Honorable Leader of Government Business indicated that the committee was comprised of individuals, just about half of them persons with disabilities, the other half parents of persons with disabilities or professionals in this space, Mr. President. And I would wish to enter the names, with your permission, of those individuals, because I think that they have done yeoman service to this country. They have done work that is both generational in its scope and in its impact, and they must be commended. As you have heard, the chairman of that committee was the Honorable Edmund Hinkson, the member for St. James North in the other place. The deputy chair was the Most Honorable Carrie-Ann Eiffel, the lifelong disabilities advocate. Also on the committee were Attorney at Law Janelle Odell, Attorney at Law Larry Smith, Communications Consultant Joyanne Haig, Special Educator Sonia Rollins, the Kaisonian Granville Carter, and the ex officio member was John Hollingsworth of the National Disabilities Unit. I also was a member of the committee, as you have heard. Mr. President, that committee facilitated consultations, 76 meetings in total, across the length and breadth of this country, with a view to hearing the perspectives of persons with disabilities. The work began with 3 town halls that were specific to the community, and then thereafter we branched off into consultations that included members of the private sector, that included members of representative organizations, the Barbados Bar Association, the Barbados Association of Medical Practitioners, so the list is long, the Social Justice Committee of the Ministry of Labor, any and everybody who would meet with us. And those consultations, in the first instance, in relation to the community of persons with disabilities, they were raw and they were real. And I think they uncovered an underbelly of this society. And really were, for those of us disabled and others of us, a call to conscience, Mr. President. And I want to thank the members of the community for persons with disabilities for so readily participating in this process. And I say that because as they participated, they exhibited a grace that was unmatched, because I think the Honorable Leader of Government Business referred to cynicism that is somewhat pervasive in our society right now. And I think given the prevailing circumstances, it would have been so easy for those persons with disabilities to say, I've said all I have had to say, I have waited as long as I have to wait, and I have nothing else to contribute. Instead, Mr. President, they came night after night and testified of their experience in the hope of crafting a better Barbados, and I think that we must applaud them. Mr. President, because of the existence of this work, the report, the policy, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Bill, I think we have reached a point where we can no longer, as a country, say that we do not know. If I am perfectly honest with you, I think that as a country, we feign ignorance quite a bit in relation to the issues of disability. And by that I mean that we say often, I never knew, no one's ever told me, if only I had thought of that. And I think the cumulative effort of this work is that we now know. The country knows. And we have to determine for ourselves the level of participation that we will have in improving this country in the name and in the interest of persons with disabilities. But we cannot feign ignorance any longer. Mr. President, I must also thank in addition to consulting with members of the community, we also consulted with the ministries, departments, and agencies of government. And in almost all of those consultations, I think all except one, the team was led by the portfolio minister. And that, I think, gave us some confidence and was a reflection of the fact that the government was taking this seriously. Those conversations were frank about what we have failed to achieve over the years. Those conversations were aspirational and I think indicative also of the very best of what we can achieve when we commit so to do. And it is on that basis that I would also wish to thank members of the cabinet, senior civil servants who joined us in that exercise. And I want to thank them because I do not think there is an issue about which there is so much work to do. Sometimes we talk about disability issues as if there are these discrete issues over to the left of our national discourse. There are those issues over there. They are not. There are issues, as the policy and as the law indicates, of education and health and culture and social protection. They are all issues. Everything that affects you as a citizen of this country also affects persons with disabilities and their ability to navigate the systems in the context of the prevailing circumstances is made more difficult by the fact that there are persons with disabilities. And so I want to commend the civil servants, the members of the cabinet for the zeal and the commitment with which they met with us and had very frank conversations. Then, of course, members of the public who would see you in the supermarket or in a fair, as has happened, and draw you to the side to tell you what they would hope to see as a parent of a child with a disability or someone working in this space. And I think that the broad consultative approach that the government of Barbados has taken to this issue, and has taken to many issues, recently, particularly those in the social services sector, where everybody knows that they have a stake in the conversation, Mr. President, is reflective of the very best of our democracy. Mr. President, the consultations led to the crafting of a national policy on disability. The national policy 2023 to 2030 is divided into 14 policy areas that, by and large, mirror the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I must hasten to add, sir, that in 2007, a Barbados Labour Party administration signed the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And of course, a Democratic Labour Party administration in 2013 ratified the convention. And so it is the reason we say that there is no political divide on this issue. We also, I should also hasten to add that the consultations to which I refer included political parties, the Democratic Labour Party being one of them, and we had quite extensive consultations with them, I think on 2 occasions, and then there was an invitation for a third. But I say that to make the point, Mr. President, that all of this is above politics, and it is reflective of a national effort to which we should all commit ourselves. Permit me to return to the policy. Sir, the policy is then divided across those 14 issue areas into definitive policy goals reflective of what we wish to achieve in relation to accessibility or housing or education. And then those policy goals are further broken down into short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals over the span of the 7 years. When you assess the policy, when you assess the task to be engaged in, you see that this is not just intended to be static legislation on a paper, static provisions, Mr. President, but that bound up in the policy is exactly how the government proposes to achieve and what exactly it proposes to achieve, I should say. So that the issues of education, the issues of health they're not simple issues, and I use those 2 issues as examples. They're not simple issues, and there are multiple things that have to be done, Mr. President, to foster the kind of inclusion and accessibility that is required, whether that is the crafting of policy, whether it is the retrofitting, Mr. President, the built environment, whether it is training for service providers. So policy area by policy area, you see the kind of interventions necessary to achieve what we hope at the end of this to be a more inclusive Barbados. Mr. President, there is a section of the policy that speaks to what life in Barbados as a person with a disability is. I really wish that every Barbadian had the opportunity to read to read that section because in very simple terms, it tells us why these interventions are necessary. It sets the context. It tells us issue area by issue area what persons have been facing, the kinds of exclusions they have been facing, the kind of enabling environment that we need to foster for us to move forward, Mr. President. And I encourage Barbadians to read the policy. It is publicly available, and I would wish that the Barbadians read all of the policies there, but particularly that section, because I think it sets in the appropriate context the realities, sir, that persons with disabilities face. The policy, as was indicated by the Leader of Government Business, sir, led to the crafting of law, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Bill. At the outset, permit me to thank the Law Reform Commission, chaired, of course, by the eminent former Chief Justice, Sir David Simmons, who saw it fit, Mr. President, to engage Dr. Jason Haynes, formerly of the University of the West Indies, to craft the bill. He had previously crafted that of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, his own home country. And they thought that so important was this bill that it could not sit in the queue of all of the other things that the government was doing, Mr. President. So I want to commend the Law Reform Commission for their contribution there. I say that St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Mr. President, has a bill. The interesting thing is that Barbados is just slightly behind many other Caribbean countries. There are about 6 or 7 other Caribbean countries that already have comprehensive and omnibus legislation on the issue of persons with disabilities. And I will tell you that when you travel regionally on the issues of disability, the concern you get from our neighbors always is, why is Barbados so late and where is Barbados? And so that is another reason, Mr. President, that I'm particularly proud that we are here today, because while we have taken some time, we have also learned from the experiences of other jurisdictions in the region with similar legislation. And so I'm not shy in saying that I think that we have the most comprehensive and fit for purpose legislation anywhere in the region, Mr. President. And if it finds favor with my colleagues today, I think Barbados will be well up front on the matters of the protection of persons with disabilities. The legislation is like I said, an omnibus piece of legislation. We thought it necessary, Mr. President, let me say that in 2022, after the government assumed office, there was a draft piece of legislation by the former administration. However, we thought it fit, Mr. President, to craft a more comprehensive piece of legislation, one more reflective of both our international commitments, but also I continue to say the challenges that face persons with disabilities, and it was important that we not just domesticate the international treaty, but that we craft a comprehensive and enabling environment for the participation of persons with disabilities in every aspect of Barbadian life. Permit me now, sir, to take you through the legislation. The legislation establishes as its guiding principles notions of equality, notions of non-discrimination, and notions of accessibility. And again throughout all of this work, but particularly the legislation, you see those as the values that undergird the effort here, Mr. President. And so, no doubt, as we go through the legislation, you will see that coming through time and again, because not only is this disability legislation, it's human rights legislation. And I think that as a young republic, as a parliament that has considered a slave code, any opportunity to imbue that which we do with the values and virtues of human rights, Mr. President, is a good thing. The legislation establishes a social empowerment agency. You know well, as does the country, that the social sector is going through reform with a view to amalgamating 4 of the entities under the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs, those being the National Disabilities Unit, the Welfare Department, the National Assistance Board, and I feel like I'm forgetting one because that's only 3. And the Child Care Board, there you go. And Mr. President, that entity that will have responsibility for those 4 agencies will become the overarching social policy, social provisioning agency in this country. And it will be referred to, as you heard the honorable member in the other place, the member for St. Michael South, indicate, it will be referred to as the Social Empowerment Agency. It is that agency that will have administrative responsibility for this bill, and by that token, Mr. President, it will have responsibility for the cooperating with government agencies on the collection of data. Let me spend a moment to talk about the dearth of data in relation to persons with disabilities. Dr. Crystal Haynes smiled, Dr. Crystal Drake smiles knowingly. There is far too little data, Mr. President, on the experiences of persons with disabilities. And as you know, Mr. President, you don't make up social policy. It has to be informed by something. And coming out of this legislation, one of the things that is going to be absolutely necessary is that the government, through this agency and others, collects the appropriate data about the lives of persons with disabilities. We know far too little. And so that is a principal part of the remit of the Social Empowerment Agency. But in addition to that, Mr. President, they will also evaluate national plans, like I indicated earlier, all of the ministries, departments, and agencies of government in their conception of ideas, in their provisioning of service, sir, have touch and concern things that also concern persons with disabilities. And as those ministries, departments, and agencies conceive of plans and execute plans, it is going to be important that this social policy agency, this social empowerment agency, Mr. President, have the remit of evaluating those plans with the view to determining whether they are fit for purpose and whether they're in line with this piece of legislation. Mr. President, the Social Empowerment Agency will also receive and investigate complaints pursuant to this legislation. And this is a big deal because far too often in our consultations with persons with disabilities, we heard about an access to justice issue. And I hesitate there for a reason, because when we think of access to justice, we usually think of the courts and our police services and so. But often what people are complaining of is the lack of access to resolution when they think that they are done wrong. And so the establishment, the ability rather, of the Social Empowerment Agency to receive and to investigate claims of wrongdoing, Mr. President, claims and breaches of this legislation provides an opportunity for persons with disabilities to have the appropriate recourse. There is an expansive list, Mr. President, in the legislation of the relevant parties that have what the attorneys refer to as standing before the tribunal, before the Social Empowerment Agency, Mr. President. And that list is expansive, Mr. President, because it proposes to cover the many permutations of persons who may be compelled for one reason or another, in one circumstance or another, to make a claim or to bring a complaint, rather, before the agency. Typically, Mr. President, what we do in relation to this matter is to only be concerned with the individual who is wronged. But these are unique circumstances, as you would appreciate. And so it is necessary for a multiplicity of individuals to have standing and the ability to make a claim, whether those are caretakers of persons with disabilities, whether they are parents of persons with disabilities, or the representative organizations who may also initiate a claim or cause a claim to be investigated by the Social Empowerment Agency, sir. And then, of course, the legislation establishes a tribunal. This is a mechanism with which Barbadians are well familiar. We have the Employment Rights Tribunal, we have a Severance Payments Tribunal, and like I intimated earlier, it is important that persons with disabilities have access to justice and to the as speedy as possible resolution of their issues, Mr. President, so that an aggrieved person can take a matter before the tribunal and have it heard, Mr. President, and have an award made out to them, I should say, in relation to this matter, or to have a resolution of some kind, because I think sometimes we comfort ourselves with the notion, sir, that what people want is monetary in nature, that they want damages, as the attorneys would say. But I think sometimes, like I indicated earlier, what people want is a resolution of their issues. And this tribunal is one of the mechanisms that will allow for individuals to have a resolution of those issues. Mr. President, I wish to take you to section 19 of clause 19 of the draft bill, because it speaks to a decision of the tribunal. It says that the decision of the tribunal is binding on the parties to the proceedings and may be enforced in the head court. The tribunal shall make a decision in 60 days, Mr. President, after a complaint has been heard. A decision of the tribunal shall be in writing and shall state the reasons for its decision. Sir, access to justice is one of the issues that we heard quite a bit in those consultations. People who have had issues over many, many years with what they will tell you is really no access to justice. This provision, sir, fixes that. Sir, the framework that the bill uses for the establishment of the mechanism through the SCA and through the tribunal is one thing, but I also want to spend some time to describe the sectoral obligations, some of the sectoral obligations. I note your caution, Mr. President, that you will constrain me if need be. To take some time to talk about some of these sectoral obligations and what they mean in very real terms to the lives of persons with disabilities. The legislation begins, sir, with the rights of persons with disabilities at section 21. And it says that persons ought to be protected from discrimination. I said to you earlier that the policy which informs the law, that one of the guiding principles is that of non-discrimination. The clause says a person with a disability is entitled to equal protection and equal benefits of the rights and freedoms of the Constitution of Barbados. And then it goes on, Mr. President, at clause 22 to talk about protection from victimization, and it outlines what constitutes victimization. A person commits an act of victimization against a person with a disability where he treats the person less favorably in those circumstances than he would treat or treats other persons. A person with a disability is treated less favorably pursuant to subsection 1, where the person, and it outlines a number of things. And I thought it important, Mr. President, to note that because I think we have to, in some ways, change the culture and the conversation in this country. And to get accustomed to the notion of equality as not a highbrow academic concept, Mr. President, but a lived reality in this country. And so the legislation goes on to talk about what constitutes victimization and protection from exploitation, violence, and abuse as well, and defines abuse in the New Age way, the very relevant way that we define abuse to include economic abuse and emotional, verbal, and psychological abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. Throughout the consultations, Mr. President, we heard persons talk about acts of deprivation that would constitute economic abuse. We heard people talk about circumstances of sexual abuse. And, you know, every provision in this bill is informed by the experience of those consultations and the testimony of particular individuals, Mr. President. Section 25 talks about sexual freedom as a person with a disability. The cumulative effect of this work, Mr. President, is that we're going to have some tough conversations. And one of them is going to be about this notion of the ability of persons with disabilities to consent to sexual intercourse, to have, Mr. President, the experience of asserting as they wish and as is lawful their sexual awareness and citizenship and all the rest of it. It is a difficult conversation, but it is a conversation we're going to have. When last I was here, when we debated the population policy, Mr. President, I averred to many of the issues which confront persons with disabilities in the context of their sexual and reproductive health rights. Everything from the absolute need for more training in our medical facilities to, like I said, just a change in culture around how we perceive persons with disabilities. My colleague and friend Janelle Odell tells a compelling story of a real story of when she was becoming a mother, a doctor saying to her, who is going to take care of this child? And why are you having a child? Those are the things that need to stop. Mr. President, the bill goes on, sir, to talk about education. As we have promoted the bill and promoted this work in the last several months, without fail, every time we appear on the radio or on the television, someone asks, if you were to choose a favorite provision of the bill, what would it be? And without fail, I dodge the question because it is, while not being a father, Mr. President, I suppose it is somewhat like asking a father who his favorite child is. But if I were to be honest, I think education is the section that makes me most excited. I have spoken in this place before about the fact that the classroom was the place that reminded me most often that I was a person with a disability, and that it meant a limit to what the world thought I could achieve. And so I am thrilled, sir, about the provisions in relation to education that quite simply establish that there's a right to quality education for persons with disabilities, because as I've said before, we've had some schools, some special needs institutions, Mr. President, but by and large, the experience of persons with disabilities in the context of education leaves a lot to be desired. And I do not have to explain to anyone gathered here what an injustice that is, because education, it has really been the springboard for the development of this country. And persons with disabilities deserve for it to be a springboard to their own self-actualization, to their own earning, to the betterment of themselves, Mr. President. The bill talks about free primary education and training of teachers, sir, and compels that the minister with responsibility for education devise a national plan in relation to disability, sir, that takes measure of the needs of persons with disabilities in the context of the educational space. Perhaps the thing that we think about most often when we think about accessible education is the built environment, and it is important. Of course, Barbados the country has, for the most part, all of the schools kind of look the same. They have very limited physical accessibility. The real issues, Mr. President, of access to certain parts of the school. So, and when I say that, I mean that there are parts of schools in this country that you couldn't access if you were a person with a disability in a wheelchair, for instance. We have constructed institutions, by and large, sir, as a former Minister of Education, you know that most science blocks are on the top floors of schools, or certainly the middle blocks of schools. What does that mean for a child who wishes to pursue science, but just simply can't get up these stairs? And these are the very real issues that we have to consider, Mr. President, and we have to consider the effect of them, and to what extent have we been limiting talent and acumen by the ways in which we conceive physically of our institutions. And then there is the issue of assistive devices and in the classroom, because persons may need a great number of things. Some persons may need the Braille readers, Mr. President, or they may need an interpreter in the classroom. They may need teaching aids that we don't necessarily think, or have not thought, rather, of as part of the regular classroom. All of this, Mr. President, is aimed at us reshaping and refashioning what education in Barbados looks like. I was pleased to hear the substantive minister in the other place, the member for St. Philip West, talk about the extent to which that which is articulated in the bill fits into the national transformation agenda. She indicated that the Alma Parish School will be reopened soon, and I am delighted to hear that, as I know many people are, because that was an institution that was closed, Mr. President, somewhat bafflingly, but that responded to the needs of persons with particular learning challenges. And I am delighted to hear that it will reopen with a view to expanding the provisioning of services for persons with particular learning needs. Mr. President, the education section goes on to talk about adult education and the like, because oftentimes when we talk about education, we think about between 3 and 16, and we don't necessarily think of those beyond the ages of 16. But of course, there are tertiary institutions, and the bill speaks to those, and it speaks to vocational training and the need for all of those institutions to be accessible and to respond to the needs of the community. Mr. President, the provisions on employment. We have all heard the devastating statistic of 90% of persons with disabilities being unemployed. And the bill compels, Mr. President, that there is equal access to employment. It compels that reasonable accommodations are crafted and are created for persons with disabilities, varying disabilities, whether those be work from home arrangements, reduced workload arrangements, Mr. President, whatever they may be, to ensure that we beat back the devastating statistic of persons with disabilities, for the most part, being unemployed. Of course, there will be exceptions in relation to this matter, things that would constitute a genuine occupational qualification, Mr. President. But by and large, this country has to commit itself to increasing the levels of employment for persons with disabilities. Sir, I will tell you that many of the pieces of legislation to which I refer to prior, contain quotas, certainly in the international space. And there was great consideration on the part of the government about whether we should legislate that employers should employ persons with disabilities to certain quotas. It was a thing, Mr. President, that kept us up at night. This question of whether we should put quotas in the legislation. Was Barbados in a place so to do? And whether that was the most appropriate thing to do. We have determined, the government of Barbados has determined that for now, there will be no quotas in this legislation. And that we will work with the private sector and with all sectors of the society to improve employment through the provisioning of a couple of things. In our consultations with the private sector, they indicated, Mr. President, that they needed more information about where they would and could get persons with disabilities from. And the ministry has committed to the crafting of a skills bank, Mr. President, that collates that data and that presents it to employers who are desirous of hiring persons with disabilities. Let me say, to the extent that it needs to be said, that persons with disabilities have the capacity and the aspiration to contribute to the bottom lines of businesses across this country, and that we must give them the chance so to do. That many of them are as qualified or more qualified than some others, and that they would wish for the chance. Of course, the government has committed that in the crafting, that as their efforts continue, Mr. President, they will hire persons with disabilities. They will engage in a greater effort to hire persons with disabilities. I hope, Mr. President, that our conversation today, that my submissions today have given you a taste of what Barbados is attempting to do on this question of improving the lives of persons with disabilities. Sir, we're having a cognate debate, and the other thing relevant in this debate is the expansion, is the increase of the parking penalty for those who park without the appropriate credentials so to do. And the leader of government business said it as best as could be said, that this is really indicative, Mr. President, of the fact that people do it is really indicative of, I don't know if Bajan wafflessness is parliamentary, but yes, and that the increase in the penalty, Mr. President, I hope that it will act as a sufficient deterrent to those who have been minded so to do. I will take this opportunity to encourage individuals who are in fact disabled and desirous of one of those parking stickers to go through the appropriate process, to visit upon the Council of the Disabled, Mr. President, and to get the sticker if indeed that is what is required. But we can no longer persist with what has been the prevailing circumstances. What have been the prevailing circumstances, Mr. President? Sir, I began by saying it is a good day. And I will close by saying that this legislation, no doubt, and the cumulative effect of this work, the report, the policy, all of it, should exist alongside the great pieces of social legislation in this country. The efforts to include persons, whether those be whoever the vulnerable of a particular period were. Mr. President, as I close, and perhaps prior to your own welcoming, I would wish to acknowledge the presence, if you would permit me, of the chairman of the committee, Mr. Edmund Hinkson, senior counsel, for, I mentioned him in his absence, Mr. President, and in his presence, I would wish to thank him for his extraordinary contribution to this work. He has indicated, Mr. President, that soon enough he will demit these places, and perhaps it is a wonderful marker to a life of service. So not only on behalf of the persons with disabilities, but on behalf of all Barbadians, I wish to salute you. Mr. President, with this legislation, with this policy, the work has just begun, And I ask that Barbadians join us in making this country better, safer, and more inclusive for every Barbadian.
Thank you very much, Senator Anne Boyce. Senator Worrell.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I rise today to support this legislation. And I do say that it is something that you will not find any controversy on this side, because we are speaking on an issue that all Barbadians would have encountered, either within our families, within our communities, and for some people even within their personal lives, because we don't know what the future holds in terms of persons with disabilities. So we support this resolution in terms of the rights of persons with disabilities, and I would also want to commend Senator Boyce in terms of his introduction, you may say, along with Senator Cummins, of the bills today and the resolution, and given some insight as to what they contain. So even though Senator Boyce may have been figuring he did not have the time to go through all of the details of the bill, I will help you today with possibly some of those that you did not get a chance to. And I'm certain that all of the colleagues around the table will do the same thing, because it is legislation. If you are bringing such groundbreaking legislation to the country, you need to champion it, you need to explain it. And the Democratic Labour Party, we support the legislation as well, as was said by both Senator Boyce and Senator Cummins. Both parties have, during their times in office, done things to push the persons with disabilities further, and to make their lives more on par with the rest of Barbadians. And also to open up the doors to people with disabilities, so that as much as possible that they can live normal lives. And I see that what this legislation is looking to do is to give some measure of independence as well to persons with disability. And if we have a vision for what is possible with a person with a disability, we are moving from an old habit, which I am hoping in Barbados it will be a thing of the past, where persons feel ashamed of a child that is born with a disability, or feel ashamed of a family member who may develop a disability, and even persons themselves who may develop some sort of disability in their lives, because we do have a number of persons, because of diabetes, become blind, or persons who become hearing impaired as they age, because of accidents even, or a simple fall can cause an individual not to be physically able to do the things that they would accustomed do for themselves, and then have to depend on others. But in terms of persons who grow up with disabilities, you want to imagine for them as independent a future as possible, because they don't just remain children, but they become adults. And many of them urge for the opportunity to have that independence as their other siblings who are normal in every aspect of it, but to have that level of independence. I'm talking about the persons from the deaf community. I'm talking about persons from the visually impaired community, and even persons that may have other forms of disabilities, but they want to be seen as an individual in themselves and have some level of independence. And that is what this legislation offers, and that is what any government of Barbados should aspire to do for all of its citizens. So based on these ideals, there is no difficulty in supporting this legislation. And all that is left for us to do here as part of the legislative process is to make all Barbadians aware of what is within the legislation and how they can access the resources, how they can benefit from it as well, and also how they can prepare to make Barbados inclusive for all Barbadians. These are terms which we've heard for a number of years. You've heard about the Rotary Club with their inclusive play activities and the park envisioned for the grounds of the gymnasium, inclusive play. You've also heard in terms of the Ministry of Education, in terms of developing mixed abilities within schools, so that you don't necessarily force persons with disabilities into a back room anymore, but you bring them out and you allow them to participate in society with other persons. And then one of the major challenges that we have as a society is the employment of persons with disabilities. And that is being discussed within this legislation. And I'm thinking that what is necessary to, everyone does not necessarily see the vision and immediately, but you may have to give some little examples and encouragement along the way so that more and more persons would buy in. Because, believe it or not, for years, persons with disabilities would find employment within companies, but to some extent, they were not treated as fairly as a regular person, or in some cases, they may have been unfair. But this legislation now speaks out against things like that and places everyone on a level footing. So without any fear, anything that Senator Boyce was not able to cover throughout the legislation, I will definitely expand on certain points that I thought were relevant to expand on, that we should know about. And I'm trusting that other members would do the same. But just not to be caught up too much in the stories of the past, because we all know of a number of situations. You will see, especially parents of a child with Down syndrome, that is a life-changing situation for that parent. In terms of, one, you have to be there for that child, not just from birth until 18, but way longer in that child's life. It often means, and then a child with other disabilities as well, that most parents, and it usually falls on the mother as the caregiver, would have to give up a considerable amount of their time in order to care for that child. And I am glad that the legislation recognized the importance of the caregivers in the process, and also recognize that during the process, the caregivers as well would also experience some challenges psychologically as well, because it is a burden for them, and you do need that assistance. We have a number of persons in Barbados today who find themselves in a situation where they have to be full-time caregivers for parents with dementia, because we have an aging population, and we have more and more of our elderly persons developing dementia, and when they reach a stage where they need constant supervision. So it would mean that a son, a daughter, or a sister, or a brother, some family member may actually have to give up their full-time job in order to take care of these persons. But for years, persons with children born with a disability, and especially those with Down syndrome, went through the same thing, because they often have to give up their full-time employment to care for these children. And it becomes a burden for them. And you need to look out for the mental state of those persons as well. And in the legislation under the section that deals with caregivers, I am happy to see that consideration was given to that as well. And it did say that financial advice and counseling would be provided to those persons. But I would like for us to envision a little bit more, because, and I am going to do it based on another thing, compare it in the legislation, and we have heard talk of expanding access to assistance from the National Insurance for persons with disabilities. Right, it has already started. When I say talk, it was discussed in the debate about expanding that assistance. We do hear the ads on the radio encouraging persons to register for this assistance including persons who may be autistic and a number of other categories. Now, why I'm saying this is that yes, it is good to provide that financial assistance to those persons, because I often heard, and I didn't seek permission to call her name, but I believe it should, as well, the deputy former president of the Senate and deputy chair of the committee, the most honorable Carrie-Ann Eiffel, often would say that disability is an expensive process. Having a disability is expensive. And you do need that financial assistance for those persons who need it. You will need it in terms of their restricted diets. They may have special diets, the physiotherapy which may be needed, access to health care, and even transportation. But I would also want for us to consider, along with the care for the caretakers, consideration that you do offer assistance, financial assistance, to those full-time caretakers. And in most cases, there are mothers who, because of the range of the disability, will find it difficult to maintain a full-time job in order to care for their children at home. And they often do this at a time where it is during the most productive time of their work life, and therefore they will be disadvantaged of building up those NIS credits which contribute towards a pension in later life. So you may find yourself with an anomaly developing in that the child is receiving benefits, or the child is taken care of up until pensionable age, up until death. And then the parent who may have given up a number of years in their working life does not necessarily have that benefit. So I think it is something worthy to think about in terms of extending that assistance to caregivers. And it is nothing novel, because this is something which is done in the United States and under the different versions of Medicare. I think it would be, in some instances, it would be Medicare Plan C, but we don't necessarily need to know the logistics of the American system. We need to be concerned about what we do here for us here in Barbados, so that if a family member has a disability and needs to have a full-time caregiver, instead of employing someone from the outside to be that caregiver, what is done is that the state pays a family member to provide that care. And sometimes it may work out better for the individual who needs the care, because I'm thinking that you would probably get better care and assistance from your family members, and it would be a full-time process as well, in terms of that person living within the household and providing that all-around care. And we need to provide access to the best quality of care for persons who will need it. So that is something that I hope that at some point in time that we will be able to consider. I'm not certain if it may fall into the parameters of the IMF austerity program, but maybe once we move out of this, and I'm certain that we are a government with the resources, and it could also come under one of the programs which the National Disability Fund, which is within this legislation, contributes to as well, so that you can make those payments to the caregivers. Also within the legislation, it is the provision of counseling services as well for persons with disabilities, and I believe that the same counseling service is also provided to the caregivers. This is indeed a plus, and it's something which is necessary. Because not only for persons who lived with the disabilities, but also for persons who have recently become disabled. And by that I'm speaking to persons who are diabetics and may have lost their vision, or persons who have become hearing impaired, or we have a number of persons who have back issues and are, physical disabilities as a result of accidents or other health challenges. And it is not easy for those persons to give up their independence and have to depend on others. I recall just a couple weeks ago hearing on the radio a caller. He was questioning a situation which may have developed, and I hope was resolved, with the person from the National Assistant Board who would normally come to their house to do laundry and other things. And for a number of weeks or days, the individual did not come. And the caller, gave the impression that no one called to say what was happening, and they depend on this person for, to get through with certain things in their lives. But they also went beyond that, because it seemed as though there was a bit of depression as well with that caller, because the person insinuated that they would just like for this whole thing to be over. Not just the situation with the person from the National Assistant Board not coming, but more so in terms of their life and the difficulty which they were going through. And I think that we must acknowledge that persons do go through depression and deal with a lot of things mentally which they may not necessarily express to persons around them. And that is where the full-time counseling services would help. Because you will also find, and some medical practitioners here would be able to give as examples, that you have a patient who, although prescribed the medication which may help, and you may find is actually not taking the medication that is necessary to help them. And that's because the person may have given up. And the only way for you to get around that is to involve the social services, including the psychological assistant, and there's to help that person to recognize that even though they may have lost some abilities, there's still hope, and that they can still transition in life and continue to do things, not at the same level at which they were before, but an acceptable level at which they can be comfortable and still maintain some level of independence. And those things would only come about through counseling services. And these need to be incorporated into our healthcare setting. And perhaps one of the areas that this legislation could drill down more into is asking that the Ministry of Health provide access to more counseling throughout the polyclinic setting and within the healthcare sector as well, because there are a number of persons that would need access to this level of counseling, and it would go a great way in terms of helping them to live more productive and happier lives, even with the disability which they're facing as well. So, but I commend the government for putting that into the legislation and recognizing the need for counseling. And one of the things that I also recognize with the legislation is that it took particular pains to capture the areas under the specific ministries which will deal with the issues. So if it is a matter with housing, it identified the housing ministry and what is expected from them. If it is a matter with education, that ministry was identified. If it was a matter of sports, culture, and community development, that ministry was identified. So just to go a little bit further into some of those things. Now, just mentioned sports and culture. We have Paralympics that every year you have the Olympics, few weeks after you have the Paralympics Championships. And I do believe that the same level of emphasis that we place on the Olympians, that we should place on the Paralympics, and encourage people, even with a disability, to still try to be as active as possible. And the same way, the same recognition that is given to them and the same funding which is given to them should be given to our Olympians, and treat them at the same level. And wherever possible, encourage them to participate. We have the NAPSAT championships here in Barbados and the BSAT championships here in Barbados. It is possibly time that we need, it's possibly time that we need to also elevate the sports for Special Olympians at that level as well, so that even young children with a disability who have that ability and that interest, you can develop them from an early age as well. And that is a form of encouragement. It goes along with the whole concept of inclusive play. So that is a form of encouragement and keeping them active. And provide the same level of funding for the Paralympians, so that, and training, and access to training facilities as well, so that when they go overseas to do swimming or cycling, whatever, or any sports, that they do have access to the appropriate trainers, that they too can come back with gold medals, and we Barbadians can celebrate them just the same that we will celebrate other Olympic athletes as well. So that aspect of it, I think, is worthy for some expansion. We also, now, I know that we are optimistic about this legislation, but we also need to, you know, we also need to be practical. Now, within the legislation, it speaks to refurbishment of facilities within 3 years for public buildings, access to public buildings within 3 years after the commencement of the legislation. This is making public buildings fully accessible within 3 years. Now, I just want to be a little cautious on that. Just around the Christmas holidays, or just before the beginning of the New Year's, in Canada, the disabled community, they were somewhat unhappy with the progress which was being made in Canada in terms of making facilities fully accessible, because I believe that 2025 was the benchmark year in which it should have been done. And I do know that within Canada, with the resources which they have, that they have gone a long way in making transportation more accessible, and where possible, the accommodations accessible, employment accessible as well to persons with disabilities, housing accessible to persons with disabilities, and public spaces. But even Canada was not able to fully meet the requirement. And this is not something which they just started. This is something, a process which was started more than 10 years ago. So I'm just saying that we need to be cautious. Yes, we would want to see it happening here in Barbados, but we have to be realistic as well. So in terms of the provision within the legislation that these buildings, public spaces, should be retrofitted within 3 years, that may be a bit too ambitious. And, right, yes, you do set a goal and an ideal, but it may be a bit too ambitious. And the only way that it can be done is if considerable grant funding is provided to, companies and to premises which would need to make these provisions. But I'm not saying that we cannot aim for it, but just be realistic that in 3 years, it would not all be done. And these are things that you need to bring the public along with you. Because in the same legislation as well, it speaks that from the commencement of this act, that new buildings that will be rented should be accessible. That is a good provision because possibly you haven't started the construction and fall in line with the building code. And I do know that the building code of Barbados does speak to this in terms of making buildings accessible. And then there are also ways so that I believe that every house in Barbados should find a way to make it accessible. Because not just for the person with a disability, but the night that you fall ill and the ambulance have to come and wheel you out of your house into an ambulance, you're gonna need that ramp. You would recognize how important that ramp is to get in and out of your house, especially if you don't have other persons there who may be able to assist the 2 ambulance workers who come to wheel you out. But you can make your houses accessible. Everybody does not necessarily have to do the full concrete work, but there are some places where there are ramps that can be moved. So, and make those provisions available, and maybe it is something that the Social Empowerment Agency can take on as a project, and with also employment for persons with disabilities as well, in terms of building some of those ramps that persons can purchase from them to place at their houses. Obviously, a ramp out of a sturdy enough material that can withstand the weight. I'm not an engineer, so that's above my pay grade, but also one that is maneuverable as well. So the engineers can consult on that, and I'm certain there's something that can be done. And for years, it could also be another employment opportunity created by the Social Employment Agency for persons with disabilities to custom make those ramps and make them available to houses and other areas that would need them, one that you can just move out and use as necessary. So that you don't necessarily, for the 3-year period, you don't necessarily have to run and do the complete brick and mortar renovation, but you can use a temporary ramp or accessible tool. All of these are things which are necessary. And with regard to the Social Empowerment Agency as well, I recognize within the legislation that a lot of responsibility is placed on this agency, which is a good thing. And I'm hoping that they will have the capacity that they can fulfill this responsibility as well. Now, when you speak to employment, there is provision within the legislation for companies to fair opportunity for employment with persons with disabilities. But obviously, you would have to make certain physical changes or provide technology that the person would be able to perform the job, or in a situation where it is a person who is hearing impaired, have the facility that they can communicate with other co-workers. In a situation where the person is visually challenged, have the facility that they can read and interpret the information. I do know that, again, I go back to the example of former president of the Senate, the Most Honorable Carrie-Ann Eiffel, when she joined this parliament way back in 2008, that the parliament provided the Braille reader so that she would be able to read the legislation which was provided and all of those things. So those are things that need to be done. That was an easy transition process because she's a person who is well aware of the technology which was available and communicated what was needed to the parliament, and the parliament was more than willing to accommodate. But you may not have every employer who has access to that type of information and may be willing to accommodate. So this is where the Social Empowerment Agency becomes an advocacy agency by, one, researching the technology which is necessary so that you can integrate it easily into a company, so that if you know that an individual is going for a job, they may be hearing impaired, what is necessary for them to be able to do the job to the best of their ability. Even someone who may be working on a construction site or in a manufacturing plant, what is necessary, and, you know, have that dialogue with the employer so that they would be able to easily make the transition and not see it as an onerous task, because you have to do a lot to push this legislation and to push the inclusivity that you are seeking. You have to be the advocates and the champions for it and not leave it to chance. If you leave it to chance, nothing will happen. And persons will just find every excuse to resist. But we want to see more persons with disabilities employed in the workplace. I'm not going to call this person's name, but we do have, and as was mentioned, we do have a number of government agencies who have persons with disabilities employed, physical disabilities, but with some of the sharpest minds. And I'm speaking in particular of one person who worked within the tourism sector, one of the sharpest minds, but had a physical disability. And you can consult with this individual on anything relating to tourism within Barbados, and they can tell you the history of it, the product, or the history of the legislation. So we will be losing out if such persons were not given the opportunity to continue their employment or to have employment within Barbados. And as was mentioned, I do believe that once you give a person with a disability an opportunity to earn a decent salary, you may very well find that you have one of your most productive employees who would probably go beyond the call of duty to make sure that the service is delivered and to deliver a quality of service beyond, to the best of their ability. I believe that Barbadians still seek out the blind workshop for a number of items in terms of mops that they do, the caning of furniture, all of those things, right? So we do have an example of the level of quality and the level of productivity that they have, that they already contribute to the workforce. So we just need to give them the opportunity to do it on a wider scale across Barbados, and let Barbados be an example for other Caribbean territories to follow, because we do know that in a number of our Caribbean territories, there's still this stigma attached to persons with disabilities. And if you see Barbados leading by example, and with persons with disabilities not being kept in the back room or in the dark, but coming forward and showing their full potential, gradually it will pick up, because some people may think that this is only something that can happen in developed countries such as the US or Canada or the UK because of the access to the resources which they have. But we can do it too with the limited resources that we have, and just do it in the way that makes sense for the with the resources which we have as well. In the legislation with regard to the tribunal, I do think the tribunal is a very good factor in the legislation to bring all of those complaints to the tribunal, and also the provision in the legislation that the court would waive fees for persons with disabilities who bring a case with any matter within this legislation. So that is a good gesture as well, because they need access to full legal rights as well. And that is something which is highly supported. I do know that the legislation only mentions for a three-person tribunal. I don't know the frequency of these cases, but perhaps in time, the number of cases that will go towards the tribunal, there may be a need to increase that to possibly 6 persons, so that or I don't know how it is that they envision that the tribunal will hear matters if an individual member of the tribunal can hear a matter or if they will hear within a panel. So it all, and what will be the combination of that panel. But, you know, and you also have the respond within 60 days. If they can do it and the judges can't, well, good for them, and we will use them as a shining example to say, well, look, it is possible. The tribunal is able to give a decision in 60 days. What's happening over there? But maybe you may want to consider increasing the number of persons on the tribunal, but that would depend on how you envision that how the tribunals will hear matters. That is another area. Now, I did mention the Social Empowerment Agency, and maybe there's one discrepancy which I did note in the legislation, which you may want to consider for an amendment. Now, the Social Empowerment Agency is mentioned quite a bit in this legislation. So this means that in order for this to work, in order for this legislation to pass, that the Social Empowerment Agency would need to be in place. But I do know that in the definitions, the Social Empowerment Agency, it means the agency established under the Social Empowerment Agency Act 2024. I don't know that such an act is in place as yet for 2024, so you may need to consider a further amendment to the legislation to the Social Empowerment Agency Act 2025, or just leave out that part altogether. But the drafters could possibly help you in terms of dealing with that. But you do mention the Social Empowerment Agency quite a bit in this legislation, so it shows that it is critical. So, and then we do know that the legislation was held over from 2024, and in the definition here, it states 2024, but that act, I don't think that there's such an act on the statute books of Barbados as yet for 2024. So that is something that may need to be considered as well. And I did think while reading through the legislation, that it may have been a problem, but it may just be the style in which the drafter did the legislation in terms of referring to ministry, as the ministries are so titled now. But I think that it may be collective ministry. So in particular, the section dealing with transport or mobility. The section dealing with transport and mobility speaks specifically to the Ministry of Transport, Works and Water, or something of, Right, 64. The ministry responsible for transport, works, and water. But I believe that that may be speaking to the different ministries that will be responsible for those areas. So that's a technical matter for the drafters to possibly look at before we pass the legislation today, that if there's need for amendment, that can be considered. Overall, the legislation does have quite a bit of interesting sections. With regard to the investigation, which comes under the Social Empowerment Agency, which drew me to, because there was no information in terms of what is the composition of the Social Empowerment Agency. It wasn't in the legislation, so then you recognize that it would be in another piece of legislation. So, because I questioned the investigators, who would be these investigators, and the competency of the investigators given the extent of the investigations which needed to be done. So that is further explanation that is needed. The legislation also speaks to, in terms of penalties for persons who hide, for want of a better term, a person who may be disabled. And that we do need to have more advocacy and education on, and we're hoping that that will become a thing of the past. That, you know, persons with disabilities would feel, or family members with persons with disabilities would feel that they can have full access to everything within the community. There are some cautions that we need to take into consideration. The mixability classes. Now, if you're going to speak about mixability classes, the legislation does speak about the training for the teachers for mixability, but you also need to have the number of persons and also reduce the number of persons in a classroom size in order for this to be effective. Because this is a challenge that you can face in a mixability environment where obviously persons will learn at a different pace, and it could be, in some cases, it may be seen as beneficial to the person with disability, but it would also put them at a disadvantage as well, and it may also put the students without a disability at a disadvantage. Because consider if a teacher does not have the resources to actually take the time to break down the information for a person who may be autistic or who may have another challenge. And you have other students who have already grasped the concept and are ready to move ahead. So to some extent, those students may be held back, and to some extent, you may also be frustrating the student who is not yet able to grasp the concept. So what I'm trying to say is not that you don't do it, but you have to make sure that you have the resources available so that the teacher's aid is important, so that you have at least one or two teachers' aid within a classroom. If you have a number of students with mixed ability, that you can give individual attention to the students who need it, and also carry on at the pace with the students who are ready to advance. But so you need to take these things into consideration, not only the training, but make the resources available. We already have some of these examples within our current school setting, in that you may have some students who may have different abilities. Some of them may be autistic, and they do not respond to the stimuli the same way as a normal child. And some teachers are finding it quite difficult to actually manage these children and also teach the other students within the classroom as well. So imagine if you have one teacher dealing with 15 to 20, and in some cases our classroom sizes are 30 or more. One teacher trying to split ourselves between these two in this situation. In some situations, there may be teachers' aides who have to spend the entire day with those particular children, because in terms of monitoring their behavior. So it then means that that teacher aide is not available to other classrooms and to other students. So if we want to have this mixability environment, training, yes, is necessary, but also providing the resources as well, so that you have the number of teachers and assistants in the classroom environment that none of the children would be disadvantaged, that you are able the work is still able to flow, because at the end of the day, you're still going to ask that teacher, have you completed your syllabus? And if they have not completed their syllabus by the end of the term or year, you will be putting that teacher under unnecessary stress. So you cannot just speak it, you need to put the resources that are necessary to make these things work. Right, and then we did speak to the rights of education to persons with disabilities, and I think Senator Boyce did speak to it as well, the right to sexual freedom as well. And again, with the sexual freedom, the inclusion of housing. Now, as I mentioned, in both administrations, we supported persons with disabilities. It was part of the policy of the former Democratic Labour Party administration to make a certain percentage of their housing accessible to persons with disabilities. If you're doing that, it means that you intend to have independent living of these persons with disabilities. So I agree that we should definitely continue to champion that and put the provisions in place that persons with disabilities would have access to housing. It would also mean that at some point in time, you may have a couple whom both persons in the couple may be disabled, and they may also want to reproduce as well. So you also have that freedom of sex for reproduction as well. And you would obviously need to provide some level of social support for those individuals so that they can live independently, that they can raise their family independently with the assistance of the necessary social support coming through the Social Empowerment Agency. So, and what we are doing here is just saying to people what is in the legislation and what the future can possibly hold, and preparing Barbadians for what can happen and what they can aspire to, giving them a vision or a roadmap for the future. So these are things that you will need to have social workers who are trained to work with a couple or a family where both of the parents in that family are disabled but capable of functioning, right? Or have some form of disability. All of these are things that I think are good to be highlighted. With regard to the employment, possibly one of the National Development Fund may need to consider providing grants. I don't know if that was already considered in terms of the committee in the planning. I know that the Social Empowerment Agency would provide grants to organizations, but providing grant funding to companies, because you need to provide incentives for persons to change what they're doing now and they're satisfied with. So if you want more persons who are disabled being employed, you have to provide some incentive that the employer would be able to employ these persons. Because, for instance, and not only in places of public entertainment and socialization, you would recognize that across Barbados, certain companies that may have been established for a number of years and have different facilities, the older facilities may not have the access for the bathrooms with accessibility for persons with disabilities, but as they've built new facilities over the years, that they have included these facilities. But not every company in Barbados have those resources that you can say, well, you know, have a 10-year plan of renovation, but may want to be a part of it, may want to employ someone who is disabled, may want to open up more of their business to persons who are disabled as well, because there's that aspect of disabled travelers, which was being championed by the Council for the Disabled, making Barbados fully accessible and encouraging travelers. I do believe that the Democratic Labour Party administration would have addressed legislation to for animals for persons who have service animals, so that they will be able to come into the country. This legislation is taken a little bit further by expanding the areas where these service animals are permitted to go. And once we have these things, we open up ourselves to a different category of tourists being able to come here to Barbados. And if we are dealing with the disability parking as well, and with that also, that legislation was first introduced in the Road Traffic Amendment in 2017, and you have the curbside access as well. All of these are things that, in terms of our infrastructure, which would need to be improved and be a regular part of our maintenance, so that you need to have the accessible sidewalks, you need to have the curbs that you can move off of the sidewalk where necessary and cross the road, all of these things, and then the facilities for disabled parking. Now, it is unfortunate that it has become necessary to increase the penalty for persons who park in disabled parking spots. And that's just education that is needed, and, you know, more people, and tolerance as well. Because I believe that as more Barbadians recognize, look, I might as well respect persons who are disabled, because I don't know what would happen to me in the future. Because you may be a able-bodied individual today, and you just have to have a stroke, or the misfortune of an accident, or unfortunately the misfortune of a gunshot wound, and you become someone who has a right to park in that disabled parking spot. And then you will recognize how critical it is for that disabled parking spot to be available at the entrance to a supermarket, at the entrance to a shopping mall, and for the ramps to be there, that you don't have to make it easy for you to just get in and get out. But also to champion the lives of people with disabilities, there's another aspect of it which we need to look at as well. By now, Barbados should have become far more automated and online, that you should be able to do more of your shopping online, have it delivered to your door. You should be able to access more of the services of the government online and not have to go and stand up in a line at the Barbados Revenue Authority to get your driver's license, or to pay your taxes, all of those things. This needs to be in this legislation as well, because there are a number of disabled persons who are fully functional with a computer, who can live independently and pay their taxes online. If they have the ability to drive, pay for their driver's license online. But we have come to a situation in Barbados, and I've experienced it myself only a couple of weeks ago. You pay for your driver's license online using the ePay system, which I love, but then you cannot get your driver's license delivered to you. You still have to go to the licensing authority and stand in a line to collect the new driver's license. These are things that are unfair to not only to the able-bodied persons, but imagine how worse it is for the persons who are disabled. And we need to, if we're championing inclusivity for all, the simple things that we can get right, let us fix them now and get them right so that they can say that they benefit from these things. And these are things that we need to do. E-commerce as well in Barbados, I believe that we are lagging behind with it. We started with it during COVID because of the necessity. Then we went back. Work from home, we were good with it during COVID, but then even the government mandated that their employees had to return to work. And this is another aspect of persons with disabilities, because another area of disabilities, we have a number of persons in Barbados who, like I would have said, suffered an injury. And as a result of that injury, they're forced out of day-to-day employment because the company, they obviously they can't work a normal 8 hours like anyone. They may be good today, but when they go home tonight, the pain starts and they can't get up to come to work in the morning. But what is stopping that individual from being able to say, well, look, I cannot get up to come to work in the morning, but I can do the work from my computer terminal at home later in the evening, but you will get your work done by the end of the day. We need to make that we need to make those provisions more accessible to Barbadians so that we will not necessarily have to have so many people depending on the disability grant, but can continue in a different form of full-time employment for a longer period of time. And with regard to the disability grant as well, this is the invalidity benefit. Not necessarily under this, but the invalidity benefit which is given. We have to take full consideration the number of persons who access this invalidity benefit, who in the prime of their work experience, and then have to take a fraction of what they were earning. But they still have a full mortgage to pay. They still have to pay for a car loan. They still have their children to send to school. They still have to pay for their utility bills, and they still have to pay for groceries. We may very well need to consider increasing that invalidity benefit, because we do know that as part of the conditions for receiving that invalidity benefit, you cannot seek any other form of employment to subsidize that income. And there are a lot of persons who are finding it very difficult to make ends meet. You, like I said, you had a good job, but because of an illness, you are no longer able to maintain that job. You went and you got a mortgage based on what you were earning. You went and you got a car loan based on what you were earning. You expanded your family based on what you were earning. And you are still the sole breadwinner for that family. Your children are not yet at the age where they can work, but you get a fraction of what you were earning before. So these are things that we need to consider if we indeed really want to make life easier for all Barbadians and be inclusive. So we need to consider increasing that disability benefit, and where possible, employers need to be more lenient as well with persons who may not be able to work a full 8-hour day, but can still do the work from at home. Give them that opportunity. We don't need to have idle servants in an office for 40 hours a week, because some people are far more productive when they work from at home. And it takes some of the traffic off the streets, and those persons who need to be on the streets for their job will find it easier to get around. All of those are things that we need, where we can do better, we need to do it better. So, Mr. President, I want to say that I have no issues with supporting this legislation, and I also want to commend the committee who would have worked on the policy and the drafters for framing the legislation. I like how the way that it sets it out in a number of different heads, like for national emergencies, you know that you would identify the persons who have a disability in the national emergencies. This is something that our DOs would champion, that they already have that information, but you've legislated here that you would provide access to them in an early stage, and for housing and all of those different areas. So it makes the legislation easy to read, easy to understand. So this is a plus for this administration, because some that they had brought before were quite cumbersome, but this one I think is palatable. And for that, and because of the nature of the topic, I support this, these 3 pieces of legislation today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Worrell. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of the sitting of the Senate for lunch until 3:15 in the afternoon.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 3:15 p.m. today. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Missing the ayes have it. The Senate is accordingly suspended until 3:15 p.m. today.